Hello everyone, Professor Kurzluck here. And so in our previous video about introduction to political economy, we introduced political economy as a field of study, as the field of study that looks at this connection between, in this relationship between states and markets. When we think about what is political economy, it's this intersection of markets and intersection of economics in the state, in governments, in nation states. So in that video, we focused on really this basic idea, the basic idea that markets do not exist outside of politics. We know that even in a capitalist system, the markets depend on roles, on institutions, of course, on property rights, contracts, courts, infrastructure, and of course, state authority. There's a ton of interesting scholarship that looked at say the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and what happened when the state kind of just disappeared and vanished, or in contemporary environments like Somalia, what happens when the state is really weak and can't even enforce property rights or courts or contracts. And so even if we take a view of maybe a hands-off approach, there is still a role for governments within the state, and it's at the most basic level to protect property rights. So we talked about that a bit in Introducing Political Economy Part 1. So let's in this video let's apply some of that framework to several major issues in comparative politics. We can think of it through welfare states, inequality, development, globalization, and authoritarian economics. So it's something that we encountered when we thought about comparative public policy, some students wrote about. Let's start with the welfare state. A welfare state is a state that provides support for people in need. Pretty basic definition that we see across textbooks. This can include maybe the unemployed, the poor, the sick, the disabled, the elderly, children, maybe even families. Welfare state policies include things like public health care, pensions, unemployment insurance, food assistance, housing support, family leave, child benefits, disability support, and Social Security. Probably things that we have all heard of in the past. We know that states handle all of these issues quite differently. Again, when you looked at your comparative public policy, you encountered issues, these public policy issues from very different perspectives within states. So welfare states exist because markets have exposed people to risk. People can lose their jobs, they can become sick, they can grow old, they can experience disability, they can maybe even be born into poverty. They can face economic shocks beyond their control. Think of periods of economic decline, maybe during COVID-19 or the 2008-2009 global financial crisis. So we see these shocks to the system where welfare programs expand. So if a state relies only on the market, then people who cannot access or cannot succeed in the market may be left highly vulnerable. So the welfare state is one way governments respond to this problem. It provides some level of social protection against market risks. But welfare states, we know, vary quite widely. Some countries provide universal benefits, meaning many programs are available to all citizens regardless of income. Other countries rely more heavily on what's called means-tested benefits, where only people below a certain income level qualify for those benefits. Some welfare systems are tied to employment itself, meaning benefits depend on one's job or contributions to social insurance. Others rely on families, charities, or private markets to provide care. So these differences reflect politics. Welfare policy is not just a technical question of economics. Again, political economy is this connection between economics and politics. So it reflects debates, reflects political debates over fairness, taxation, work, citizenship, poverty, deservingness, and the role of government. So, for example, we know that some societies view healthcare as a basic right. Others treat healthcare more as a market good. Some societies believe the state should reduce inequality. Others worry that too much redistribution discourages work or disincentivizes work or disincentivizes innovation. Some scholars argue, some maybe people you encounter on the news say, well, this just creates dependency on the government. Other societies, though, are willing to pay maybe higher taxes in exchange for stronger social benefits. Others prefer lower taxes and maybe more individual responsibility. So this is why welfare states are central to comparative politics, and we think about them. They reveal how different societies answer the same exact question of what do citizens owe each other. So welfare policy also connects directly to inequality and class politics. Class theory argues that a person's position in the economic system can shape their political interests. Workers, employers, professionals, farmers, investors, and public employees may experience the economy differently. They may therefore support different parties, policies, and ideologies. So in class, when we introduced the idea, we talked about globalization and how globalization impacts GDP growth and employment opportunities. Well, one thing that we talked about was it depends a lot on where you sit for do you support globalization or do you think globalization has been good for your community? If your job is now more globally competitive and you can demand a higher salary and more job security, well, then you might support globalization more. Conversely, if you are maybe a steel worker in the Rust Belt that you view your job has been outsourced, well, then where you're sitting means that those policies, those economic policies and decision choices, you are probably more likely to be against because you saw the downside of those policies. So we know that economic policy is rarely neutral. Tax policy creates winners and losers. Trade policy creates winners and losers. Labor law creates winners and losers. So housing policy. We see all of these policies that a lot of times it depends on where you're sitting at. So it's worth digging deeper into for a minute, thinking about trade because it's in the news so much. Textbooks talk about this. It's really one of the most pressing issues that we've probably all encountered, even if we don't follow the news every day. But it comes up during election times. It's probably something your parents talk about and you see around you in society. So free trade, lowers prices for consumers and opens foreign markets for exporters. So it can lower prices because you're importing goods. So if it's made cheaper abroad and you import it, the theory goes, the empirical evidence shows that prices lower. But it can also expose domestic industries to that foreign competition. So if we're importing goods because they're cheaper, well, that might damage domestic industries. Some firms may benefit, while others may actually lose. Some workers may gain from this new opportunities, while others may lose stable jobs. So this was a massive debate in the 70s and in the 80s and continues into today as deindustrialization has ravaged what we now call the Rust Belt. So when we think about trade, a country may gain economically overall, while specific regions or sectors may suffer pretty serious job losses. So this helps explain why globalization has produced such political backlash in many, many countries. Globalization can create growth, efficiency, and as a whole, lower prices. But it can also create job insecurity and deindustrialization, whole regional and city decline, and of course resentment towards political elites who appear disconnected from ordinary citizens when they talk about how great globalization is. So this connects really closely to neoliberalism. Neoliberalism refers to a revival of classical liberal economic ideas, especially from the late 20th century onward. It emphasizes, as we talked about in the first video, free markets, privatization, deregulation, lower taxes, reduced welfare spending, and openness to global trade and investment. Supporters of neoliberalism argue that markets are the most efficient, are more efficient than states, and that economic freedoms encourages growth. Critics, though, argue that neoliberalism weakens labor, increases inequality, reduces social protections, and gives too much power to corporations and financial markets. So the global financial crisis that began in 2008 and really spread in began in 2007, really spread in 2008, really intensified these debates that we continue to encounter today, nearly 20 years later. The 2008-2009 global financial crisis revealed how financial deregulation, speculation, and risk-taking in one country could quickly spread across the global economy. It also showed that when markets fail, states are often expected to step in. Governments bail out banks, stabilize financial markets and whole financial systems, and in 2007-2008 used public resources to prevent the collapse of private entity. So this created a pretty major political discussion. If markets are supposed to reward success and punish failure, the argument why were powerful financial institutions rescued while ordinary people suffered unemployment, housing losses through foreclosures, and austerity. So we saw the emergence of movements like the Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011 that was still demanding and questioning the Obama administration of why they bailed out banks, but not the 99%, which was their rallying cry. So this raises a question that really became central to debates over inequality, fairness, and democratic accountability. So thus, political economy also helps us understand development. One of the oldest questions in comparative politics that we first introduced on Monday is why some countries become wealthy while others remain poor. There are many possible answers. Some scholars emphasize institutions such as roles of law, maybe property rights, effective bureaucracies, and of course, low corruption. Other scholars have emphasized maybe it's geography, maybe it's the remnants of colonialism, education, technology, state capacity, or integration into the global economy. Something that our textbook brings up, and it's worth just spending a minute on, is the idea of dependency theory. Dependency theory offers a pretty important critique that we should just have in mind. The theory argues that poor countries are not simply behind wealthy countries on the same path of development. Instead, they may be disadvantaged by their position in the global economy. Wealth, resources, and profits, dependency theorists argue, oftentimes flow from poorer countries on the periphery to wealthy countries at its core. This creates patterns of dependence that can be difficult to escape. So this perspective, this theory that some scholars utilize helps explain why some countries have been skeptical of free trade. Free trade may sound good in theory, they argue, but countries enter the global economy from unequal positions. Wealthy countries often have advanced industries, technology, capital, and bargaining power. Poorer countries may rely on raw materials, agricultural exports, or low-wage labor. And so thus, as a result, countries have have experimented, I guess, with different development different development types. One strategy we see is import substitution. This means protecting domestic industries from foreign competition so that local firms can develop. Governments may use tariffs, quotas, subsidies, or even state planning to reduce dependence on foreign manufactured goods. The idea is you create some trade barriers that way, and maybe some subsidies to local manufacturing, that local manufacturing can grow, and then you knock down those trade barriers and your goods are thus globally competitive to export to the rest of the world. Another strategy is export-led growth. This means producing goods for global markets instead of focusing mainly on the domestic economy to grow your industry. States and farms use global demand to build industries, expand manufacturing, and increase thus national income in the national manufacturing base. So a related strategy that appears in the news every once in a while, so maybe some of us have heard of it, is something called industrial policy. Industrial policy refers to government efforts to support specific sectors or national economic goals. Something you've probably encountered just by loosely following the news. So this could involve maybe subsidies, infrastructure, public investment, training, research, maybe other types of subsidy policies, things that you've probably heard. Industrial policy has really become more important again because of concerns over supply chains, national security. You'll oftentimes hear that we need to build domestic industries because of national security concerns, maybe through climate change or technological competition. So finally, political economy is also essential for understanding regime types and authoritarian regimes. So we know that authoritarian governments do not face the same kind of electoral accountability as democracies, but they still need to maintain power. They need elite loyalty. They need the elites not to rise up. They need for a revolution from below not to occur because the economy is so bad. So if they need citizens and elites to remain compliant or demobilized, they need resources to fund the military, the police, the bureaucracy, propaganda, and patronage. Things that we've talked about throughout the semester as being important for autocrats to maintain power. So one way that authoritarian regimes maintain loyalty is through kind of a performance bargain, we could call it. The regime provides economic growth, stability, maybe public order, maybe rising living standards. In exchange, citizens avoid challenging the political system, avoid challenging those at the top. This bargain is not necessarily formal. You don't get your bargain in the mail and you fill it out, but it can be politically important. Oh, down she goes. Sorry about that. Got a little carried away. However, this does create some risk. If economic growth slows, if inflation increases, inflation rises, corruption becomes too visible, or living standards decline, the regime may face legitimate pressure. But authoritarian regimes, as we know, have tools that democracies do not. They can censor information, repress protests, manipulate elections. They can blame foreign enemies. Think about the rally around the flag effect that we talked about. Or co-opt powerful business elites to fall in line. So state capitalism is especially important and emerges here. State capitalism is a system in which the state maintains significant control over the economy while still using markets and private enterprise. In authoritarian regimes, this control can serve both economic and political purposes. It can support economic growth, but it can also reward allies and punish opponents of the regime. Those that play ball and get along with the regime might benefit from government contracts. So this connects to something else that is important to keep in mind, and that is rent seeking in rentier states. So rent seeking occurs when actors use political connections to gain wealth without creating new value in the economy. Instead of competing through innovation or new productivity, they compete for access to state contracts, licenses, monopolies, subsidies, or natural resources. So a rentier state, thus, is a state that receives much of its revenue from natural resources, such as oil or gas, rather than through broad taxation. This matters politically because when rulers do not depend heavily on taxing citizens, they may feel less pressure to provide accountability. Resource revenues can thus fund things that we've talked about throughout the semester: patronage, repression, or subsidies. So we can see how autocrats use these tools to maintain power and repress society. So this does lead to something that we should spend a minute talking about, something called the resource curse. The resource curse refers to the idea that countries rich in natural resources sometimes experience increased corruption, weak institutions, and actually slower economic development. Or, in the worst case, simply become or remain authoritarian states. Natural resources do not thus automatically produce democracy or economic growth, and they do not automatically produce these outcomes. But when institutions are weak, resources can make political problems all the worse. So, the broader lesson is that economic systems are also political systems. Again, this connection between economics and politics. Welfare states can shape citizenship. Trade shapes political coalitions. Inequality shapes political participation and trust. So the main takeaway from this video and from the reading is that political economy helps us understand who gets what, who has power, who bears risk, and how states organize economic life. So in comparative politics, we are not simply asking whether a country is rich or poor, capitalist or socialist, democratic or authoritarian. We are asking how economic systems and political systems interact with each other. So worth thinking about political economy, a huge field. Multiple courses can be taught on political economy. I have a master's degree in international political economy, but this was a nice introduction, a nice concluding chapter to our comparative politics textbook. And this is the end of the textbook after 18 chapters. Thank you.